Hey, what's going on, everybody? My name is Corey, better known as the Seaman. Now I want to welcome you to another edition of the Seaman's Cinema Sit-Down. Man, I'll be out on Front Street. I don't actively look for documentaries the way I probably should, because every time I seem to watch a doc, I absolutely love it. Probably because if you've gone far enough to complete a doc, it's probably because the story is interesting. And the story in this documentary, goodness me, it is beyond fascinating, mind-boggling, screwed up, interesting, confusing. How do you let something like that happen? It's one of those just wild off-the-wall stories. And if you saw my live reaction, I said that I wasn't going to do a non-spoiler for this one. So this is going to be just a straight-up spoiler discussion. If you want the non-spoiler, check out the live reaction. What am I talking about, you must be asking yourself? Well, don't worry, I'm not going to leave you hanging. Pull up a chair, take a seat. I'm diving into all the spoilers on Three Identical Strangers. This is just an absolutely fascinating documentary. Now, knowing it's a doc and hearing Three Identical Strangers should probably clue you into the fact that this movie is going to be about triplets that didn't know they were triplets. And that's exactly what this movie is. It's a story about three brothers who were all separated at birth by adoption. They were put into an adoption agency, and at the agency, all three were separated, went to three different families. And it's wild. The story's wild. One, it's wild how they meet each other. And then the reason for why they were separated at birth is even more wild. So let's just dive right into all of it, man. And like I said, the first wild part is how they meet. So we have three brothers, and the first one that we're introduced to in the movie is Robert Shafran, Bobby. So Bobby goes to a community college in Westchester. And it's his first day on campus. He's walking to like his room, and literally everybody that walks by him is like, "Hey man, how's it going? Oh my gosh, so good to see you. How you doing? How was your summer?" Yada. And Bobby's like, "I don't know. And is this what college is like?" Next thing he knows, girls are coming up to him, kissing him on the mouth, and like just really, really strange reactions. Now, being someone who went away to school, to not community college, I went away to school. I didn't even experience that. Like that's not what happens. But Bobby didn't know any better until, I think his name, I want to say it was Dan, maybe? But somebody who knew this other guy comes by this room and sees this kid that looks familiar. He's like, "That's weird." And when the kid turns around, he like does a double take, like, "Holy crap, that looks exactly like my buddy Eddie. But I know that that's not Eddie because I know where Eddie is." So he looks at this kid and he goes, "Hey, what's your name?" And, Robert Shafran. He's like, Bobby. And he's like, "Bobby, you're not going to believe this, but I think you have an identical twin brother." And Bobby's like really confused. They go running down to a telephone booth. Right before the world of cell phones, this stuff's going on. And they all somehow found each other without like major internet and cell phones. It's crazy. But so they run to the payphone. Same thing. He calls him. He's like, "Eddie, you're not going to believe this, but I think I found your identical twin brother." They bring Bobby over to Eddie's, and sure enough, it's like looking at a mirror. And the most fascinating thing I thought was when, Bobby or Eddie's friend said, like, "You're watching them," and it was like watching a movie where you have two actors mirroring each other, like it's a mirror. Only they weren't trying to do that, and they weren't actors. They were actual twins that, like, in front of each other. Like if one moved his head to the right, the other did. Like their mannerisms were the same. They looked obviously identical. The way they talked and laughed and acted, everything matched up with these two kids. And it became like a national phenomenon. It was all over the news. It was in the papers. They started ending up on talk shows. And all of a sudden, this third family in Westchester sees the newspaper and is looking at it, and they see two of their son. And they call him up, and they call over, and sure enough, they all get together, and boom. David Kellman is the third of the brothers, and Eddie's last name was Galland. I didn't say that. Eddie Galland. So you have Eddie Galland, David Kellman, and Robert Shafran. Three identical twin brothers at the age of 19 learn of each other. No prior knowledge. And it was just crazy that they naturally stumbled into each other. But then when you found out how close they were, proximity, like all these Westchester County towns, kind of crazy that they hadn't run into each other. And the other interesting thing too, and all the boys noticed this, is that each one of them was coming from a different economical background. I want to say, I think Eddie was I don't remember which one was which, but one of the families was well off. One was kind of middle class, and one was like kind of lower middle class. And like they just thought all of these things were interesting, but they got swooped up in the hoopla of like, oh my gosh, like 3 identical brothers have found each other. And like I said, they were like minor celebrities, man. They were out in New York partying all the time. They're just having so much fun. You know, they ended up opening up a restaurant in the city called Triplets, and just it's like this magical fairy tale story, and we're only like half hour in. And you start to notice that we're on screen, we're seeing both Bobby and David talking, but we're never seeing Eddie. And the more and more the story goes, the more you're starting to go, something's gonna happen. Like there's gotta be a twist, because why hasn't Eddie been brought in yet? And sure enough, that twist happens, and it is not the kind of twist I don't think anyone could possibly think to expect. So now, once the brothers kind of meet each other and they start kind of becoming involved in each other's lives, you find out that both Bobby and David said that Eddie got the most out of the 3 of them meeting. You know, it was like he all of a sudden had this new family, and he was just so caught up in it. You know, he loved the idea of the restaurant, all these things that they were doing, that it was no surprise that he was the one that wanted to find their biological mother and find out why, like, they were all separated, right? Like, here, it's one thing to know you're adopted and like wonder why you were put up for adoption, but now you find out not only were you put up for adoption, but so were 2 identical brothers to you, also put up for adoption, and they wanted to go find her. And sure enough, they were able to track her down. And the interesting thing that both Bobby and David say in the movie is that, you know, that she was a drunk, and there were things about her that kind of made them all go, uh-oh. Like, what if, like, that's, like, you know, she seemed a little off. But upon meeting her, they all thought it to be a good experience, but not one they needed more than that. Like, they didn't need to involve this woman in their lives because they all had families. And it was interesting to see, like, a group of triplets act that way. Because you so often, at least in the media or, like, in the experiences that I've had, my family did foster care and we've adopted kids. You don't always see it work out that way. You know, sometimes it's kind of negative, or it's like so positive then the person's involved in their lives. But to have a positive-ish kind of interaction, just go, that was all we needed, was interesting. But she wasn't able to answer the question on why they were separated. She just, you know, kind of told them, like, the adoption agency that they went to. And sure enough, going through, like, library records, they're able to find the hospital and, like, where they were born. So they start digging more, and the families get involved, and they ultimately end up at the agency. And when they get there, they're like, why did you separate these boys? And the agency explains that, look, it's really hard to place twins, let alone triplets, and if we were going to try to place triplets, it probably wouldn't have worked, and the best thing that could have happened for the boys was to be in the best situation possible for each of them. To which all the parents said, had we known there were 2 more, we would have taken them. And ultimately, that's the kind of conversation that gets had, and everyone's just kind of disappointed and let down, like there wasn't more, and something still didn't feel quite right to anybody. And the one father realizes that he forgets his umbrella, and he goes back in. This is where it just gets wild, man. He goes in and sees all of these board members at this adoption agency popping champagne and celebrating, basically saying, like, wow, that was a close one. Now, even as a viewer, you're going exactly what the families are thinking. Like, wait, well, what does that mean? Missed that what? And what they ultimately find as they do more and more digging is that there was this man, I can't remember his name, but he was like a scientist, and he wanted to do this, like, social experiment with identical twins, where he would find them in identical twins or triplets that would come into this one adoption agency. They would take them and on purpose separate them to see what would happen to separating identical twins. Because if you think about it, you spend 9 months in a very, very compact place together. And then even the parents said in this, like, the first 6 months of their lives, they were in one crib next to each other, and then all of a sudden, all three of them were the only person in the crib. So, stuff like that, they were trying to do this via a study. So messed up, man. Like, you're not just, like, it's not like you're studying people who are actively volunteering. Like, you're legitimately ruining family members' lives by withholding the fact that they're twins or triplets. It's one of the things that adoption agencies aren't supposed to do. They're supposed to try to give at least as much information as they are allowed to about, any other family members or things of that nature. And what this group of people ultimately find out is that they were basically, like, experimented on, man. Like, there was a person who would come to the house, and it was kind of like, the agency person, like, checking up to see how everything's doing, but really is taking all these notes for this study. And the more and more the family dig, the less and less they find. And that had a profoundly negative effect on Eddie. And basically what happened is, after finding out that, like, they were kind of like lab rats, it really messed with Eddie in a bad way, to the point where he started kind of having erratic behavior, where he, like, would just almost, like, I think his family even said, like, we were thinking, like, it could be bipolar disorder or something, and they went and they took him in, and it turned out he had manic depression. So he ended up staying in a facility, I think, for 3 months before they released him out. And what we learned is that all three kids were dealing with some kind of depression. All three sets of parents, like, come on screen and tell you, like, their children would, like, knock themselves out by banging their heads into, like, the crib. All three boys did this. And just watching the movie, that this has to do with separating those three boys. Adding on top that, like, their mother, there could have been, like, mental illness history within the family already. Add on top of separating three triplets like that, and when Eddie broke out into the manic depression, he had to go to a facility. He came out and seemingly was okay, but never was really the same. And one day, he's working at the front of the restaurant, and I believe it was Bobby was working in the back, or maybe it was David. And all of a sudden, like, his wife calls him. He's like, "Hey, isn't Eddie supposed to be there? I think his car's here. Do you want me to go in the house and check on him?" And the next call is, "You need to get here." And when Bobby does, it's just police cars and ambulances. And he parks. He didn't even close his door, and just sprints up. And they find out that Eddie ended up committing suicide. So now you throw that into this story, and you're like, geez, man, this is so beyond messed up. And ultimately, they find out that kind of with them appearing and finding each other, it kind of made the study stop. I believe the study ran from, like, 1960-something to 1980-something. And it stopped shortly after the three boys found themselves. And the more and more they dug, they just kept finding dead ends. By this point, as grown adults, as they started to research more, the agency no longer existed. The guy who was running the study was dead. And they ultimately found out that the study was being kept, I think, at Yale. And it was, like, supposed to be sealed. It could not be opened until, like, 2060. Basically, it would be a time where you would think most people who could have been involved in the study would have died by then. And what's even crazier is during the making of the doc, they were not granted access to these papers. There are actual people whose lives were messed up by this social experiment, and they wouldn't grant them access. By the time the movie came out, they were granted access. It was tacked on at the end in words, that they finally did let Bobby and David go see the study. And they come out and they're like, most of it's heavily redacted, and there's no conclusion because the study just kind of stopped. So here's this story about three identical strangers, triplets, that are separated at birth or shortly after birth, around 6 months, I think they were all placed. And you ultimately they find each other, and you go on, like, this awesome, like, fun journey with them through this part of the story, and then you get to the end, and you're just, like, horrified, and, like, you feel so much for this group of people, especially when you find out what happens with Eddie and just, like, everything else that goes into it. And then the even crazier thing is that they found a pair of twin girls who the same kind of a thing had happened to, and they inserted them into the story to kind of give some more. And we find out that they were also part of the experiment, and that there was a journalist also involved in the doc who was trying to dig up stuff on the study but couldn't get anywhere. And he even found a tape where he actually physically talked to the guy, and he had forgotten about it because he's like, he obviously couldn't have said anything. And they played it, and you can literally hear this guy dodging every question in a way that just makes you go, this guy is so shady. And that journalist is in the doc, and what he says is the thing that blew me away the most. Is there are a group of people between 1960 and 1980 something that if you were in the Westchester area where this agency was and you were adopted, there is a chance that there is another person who looks identical to you that one day you could just turn the corner and bump into yourself. He said that and my head exploded. Like, oh my gosh, man, like this story isn't done. Like, it's not just this group of people. There could be any number of people that don't know that they're biological identical twins or triplets even. Like, it's wild to think that that's possible. Now, like, people who were asked said, oh, it was a very low number of kids. But for a study that was going on that long, granted you were watching the kids from, birth up, but like, you watch the doc and you feel like there was definitely more than just a handful of, like, kids involved in this. Absolutely fascinating, man. And like, horrifyingly, like, disgusting and disturbing that, like, someone in the name of science would, like, purposely separate, like, twins or triplets. And like I said, my family has done foster care in the past, and we have adopted, and most times in those situations you do everything you can to keep the siblings together. If there is a sister or a brother, the agencies usually will tell you they also have a sister or a brother who are here or here, to see if they can kind of keep them together. There's the thing that there was a point in life that there a group of people would actively think to separate kids like that. It's horrifying and, like, disturbing, especially with the fact that there could be kids that don't know they're twins. So there you go, man. 3 identical strangers. I mean, obviously, if you've watched this, I've told you everything there is to tell you. But if you don't mind being spoiled and you haven't seen it, go check it out. This doc is so worth it. Because it's just a fascinating story. It'll pull you in right away, and you are literally glued to your chair and eyes to the screen ingesting the story. And even if I did spoil it, the movie does a hell of a lot better job telling the story than I do. So that's all I got to say about 3 Identical Strangers. It's your turn. Please hit those comments. If you've seen the movie, feel free. Spoiler away. Hit those comments. Let me know what you thought about the movie. If you didn't see the movie, what do you just think of what I've said about the topic, just this general conversation? Hit it all. Leave it in the comments. As always, if you are new here, please hit that subscribe and the little bell so you get alerts every time I make a new video. For the Seaman's Cinema Sit Down, I am the Seaman. I'm signing off. Peace! Oh, jeez. You guys are still here? Well, if you are, you might as well check out a video like this guy or this guy. And if you haven't, could you please hit that subscribe button like that guy over there? Thanks, man.